iDubbbz is a creator whose internet career has been more chaotic than a reality show wedding. Once crowned the king of edgy commentary, he didn't just push boundaries, he set them on fire and roasted marshmallows over the flames. His early work was a rallying cry for the anti-PC crowd, let's face it, mostly right-wing folks, who adored his irreverent pushback on progressive sensibilities. But in a plot twist worthy of a soap opera, that same audience is now his favorite target. At some point, iDubbbz swapped his devil-may-care satire for what can only be described as woke karaoke, pandering to the morally bankrupt left with all of the enthusiasm of a kid trying to fit in at the pool table. And no, this isn't a transition. Don't get excited. It's a calculated move to stay relevant with a crowd that prefers ideological conformity to actual creativity. Lately, iDubbbz has dipped his toes or maybe belly flopped into the murky waters of political discourse, taking on two hot-button issues: transgender athletes and life rights. Yes, life rights. Because, let's be honest, the abortion debate isn't about choice. That's just a shiny distraction, like jingling keys in front of a toddler. The real issue is whether unborn individuals have a fundamental right to life. But rather than grappling with the complexity of these debates, iDubbbz opts for the intellectual equivalent of fast food. Oversimplified narratives designed to butter up his shrinking fan base while painting anyone who disagrees as some combination of Neanderthal and comic book villain. With that context set, let's unpack his video on the Aainkhif Olympics scandal, a masterclass in moral grandstanding, selective outrage, and hypocrisy so thick you could cut it with a butter knife.
People don't go into fighting that had great lives. And people don't do well at fighting that had great lives. So now I'm looking at this athlete. I don't imagine she was Miss Popular at school. I don't imagine a lot of nice things happened to her. But I do know the sacrifice that it would take to make an Olympic team, let alone to make the Olympic finals. You have no money. You have no job. This doesn't pay. But there is one payoff, which should you succeed, and only 3 of them will, gold, silver, and bronze, somebody somewhere will pat you on the back and tell you good job. She's an amateur athlete. She's gonna go fight 4 people this week and get nothing for it. None of you would have even known she was fighting. So now imagine you reach your goal, you sacrificed, you ate the SpaghettiOs, you lived 3 deep down in mom's basement, you did all of these things, and you brought honor to your country. And not only did somebody not tell you good job, which is the only thing you ever hope to get, they now do the opposite. And they tell you you're a man. You think life for her gets better? This is such a terrible thing for her to have said about her. And it's not true. There is no test.
Ah, yes, the iDubbbz opening gambit, a chill sauna monologue paired with a cinematic montage of Aainkhif's blood, sweat, and online tears. It's like a trailer for a feel-good sports biopic that forgot it's supposed to be a YouTube video about fairness and competition. Sonen's monologue is the foundation here, a classic appeal to authority. Sonnen, the lovable loudmouth of combat sports, is great at spinning a yarn, but let's be real. His expertise in fighting doesn't exactly make him the Dalai Lama of sports ethics. iDubbbz starts with Sonnen because Sonnen sounds confident, and confidence, as we all know, is YouTube's favorite substitute for actual substance. By opening with Sonnen's words, iDubbbz tries to drape his argument in the veneer of credibility, like slapping a Rolex sticker on a Casio. And what about Sonnen's monologue? It's a Hallmark card for fighters. They sacrificed everything. They ate SpaghettiOs. They lived in basements. Sure, it's moving, until you realize it's a total oversimplification. Not all fighters come from tragic backstories. Some come from wealth, private coaches, and diets that don't include canned pasta. This isn't Rocky Balboa, it's the Olympics. Romanticizing struggle doesn't answer the actual question. Do Khalif's biological traits give her an unfair advantage? But hey, Sonnen's here for the vibes, not for the facts. Then Sonnen boldly proclaims that criticism of Khalif being labeled a man is unjustified and untrue. Bold words, except they come with 0 receipts. Khalif reportedly failed a gender eligibility test, which found XY chromosomes. This information was reported by Al Jazeera on March 24, 2023, citing Khalif's disqualification from the Women's World Boxing Championships after her test results were revealed. Whether you love or loathe these tests, pretending they don't exist is just intellectually bankrupt. And Sonnen caps it off with, "There is no test," as if tests for biological sex are a figment of our collective imagination. It's like he expects us to forget science exists because he said it with a straight face. But iDubbbz doesn't stop there. He sprinkles in reactions from Logan Paul, Charlie Kirk, and Riley Gaines, like seasoning on a hot dish of misdirection. The goal? To paint critics as a gaggle of right-wing grifters and social media clowns. So you're too busy laughing to notice the real discussion being ignored. Sure, Logan Paul admitted to spreading misinformation and some posts were deleted. Does this mean the entire conversation about fairness in sports is invalid? Of course not. This is a classic red herring. Look at the fools! Well, the actual issue sits untouched in the corner, awkwardly sipping its drink. And what about the deleted tweets mentioned in the headlines? iDubbbz waves them around like trophies, implying Piers Morgan and J.K. Rowling backed down because they were wrong. But hold on, Piers wrote about the issue in the New York Post as recently as November 4th, firmly sticking to his guns. So clearly, his post wasn't deleted because he changed his mind. So legal threats, PR cleanup, who knows? But iDubbbz doesn't care. It's more useful to imply silence equals guilt than to investigate why silence exists. This whole opening is just rhetorical theater. It's not about fairness, ethics, or even the actual controversy. It's about carefully choreographed manipulation of emotions. By draping Khalif in the heroic narrative of sacrifice and suffering, iDubbbz hopes he'll conflate sympathy with justice. It's like a stage play with plenty of dramatic monologues and tear-jerking moments, but the spotlight never shines on the elephant in the room. Now, if this is the appetizer, you can bet the main course will be served with extra cherry-picking, a side of misdirection, and just a dash of moral grandstanding. So let's keep going. This buffet of bad arguments isn't over yet.
It might feel like a gender controversy at the Olympics is a very 2024 kind of issue, but we've always been obsessed with other people's gender. Like, ever since the 30s, we were like pointing fingers at other countries saying, your women aren't like our women. Our women are normal. Your women are actually men dressed up as women. And as soon as that thought like permeated the globe, like we haven't been able to let it go. And now that people are trans-identifying, it feels like all of it has like reached a boiling point. So the transgender women and even the cisgendered women, they're all getting shat on. It takes no prisoners. We got Alona Mar.
I always get these comments, but like recently it kind of ramped up. I get comments being called a man and being called masculine and asking if I'm on steroids.
You got Katie Ledecky also being called a man. You can rest assured that if you're a woman who's talented in sports, you're going to be called a man. You also have two Zambian football players who are targeted specifically by Australian news outlets.
There's two athletes in the Zambian football team who played against the Matildas the other day.
Two of them are on the Zambian football team, and our Matildas went to play with them. You have to ask yourself, were you not a biological male, would you have scored twice against our girls?
What's even worse?
All girls are girls. All girls are girls. All girls have long hair. All girls have XX chromosomes. The Matildas. We should rename the Matildas the XXs so they know that we're girls. And lastly, you have Lin Yuting of Taipei and Iman Khalif of Algeria, the two women boxers who are competing at this year's Olympics.
iDubbbz gives off the energy of that one guy in class who proudly reminds the teacher they forgot to assign homework, only to turn in a blank sheet because he didn't understand the assignment in the first place. First, iDubbbz begins by generalizing about society's obsession with gender in sports, linking it to historical accusations from the 1930s. Sure, there's some historical precedent. Female athletes like Stella Walsh and Dora Rachin faced accusations of being male during that era, often driven by xenophobia or sexism. But let's be honest, accusing people of being something they're not was basically the 1930s version of subtweeting. According to a Journal of the History of Biology article published in 2016, these controversies largely stemmed from a lack of standardized testing and overt prejudice, not scientific evaluation. In other words, they were playing guess who with zero rules. This is worlds apart from today's discussions, which focus on measurable biological differences like testosterone levels, muscle mass, and bone density. Factors that directly impact performance. You know, actual science, not just some guy squinting at a track star and saying, I don't know. Something seems fishy about that one. By conflating past controversies with modern debates about transgender athletes, iDubbbz paints a misleading picture. The current issue isn't about arbitrary judgments of femininity, but about maintaining fair competition based on clear, objective criteria. This false equivalence reduces a complex science-backed discussion into an emotionally charged historical rehash. It's like comparing an Olympic debate to a middle school rumor mill. One is rooted in actual rules, the other in vibes. Next, iDubbbz claims that transgender women and cisgender women are equally targeted in sports. To back this up, he offers examples like Alana Mar and Katie Ledecky being called masculine. Sure, these athletes have faced baseless online criticism, but comparing this to the scrutiny surrounding athletes like Iman Khalif is like comparing a mosquito bite to a shark attack. According to the International Boxing Association, Khalif Khalif failed a gender eligibility test that detected XY chromosomes, a test designed to uphold fairness in women's categories, in line with guidelines inspired by the International Olympic Committee. These aren't insults thrown in a comment section. They're the result of policy-driven investigations. The difference here isn't just apples and oranges, it's apples and astrophysics. One's an annoying fruit fly, the other requires rocket science to comprehend. To further muddy the waters, iDubbbz brings up the Zambian football players accused of being biological males, but he glosses over the details. The controversy wasn't about gender identity, but about whether their physical traits gave them an unfair advantage. As reported by the Sydney Morning Herald in July 2023, the concern stemmed from inconsistencies in international football regulations, not from baseless accusations like iDubbbz paints it out to be. By ignoring this nuance, iDubbbz creates a straw man, pretending all criticisms are baseless bigotry to sidestep legitimate questions about fairness. It's a bit like saying all complaints about bad driving are just anti-car propaganda. And then comes the sarcasm. Girls, XX chromosome, and this naive suggestion to rename the Matildas. It's a comedic flourish, sure, but it's also a blatant dismissal of scientific realities. According to the British Journal of Sports Medicine, athletes with XY chromosomes and elevated testosterone levels retain significant advantages in speed, strength, and endurance even after years of hormone therapy. These aren't just trivial differences. They're performance factors that can alter the outcome of a competition. By mocking these concerns, iDubbbz isn't engaging with the science, he's ridiculing it. It's like someone laughing at gravity while falling off a cliff. Funny? Maybe. Smart? Not so much.
As a professional boxer and boxing promoter and radical trans activist, I felt like this story was tailor-made for me. One of the first things that I discovered was that there were more people talking about Aainkhif than the Olympic Dutch rapist. The celebrities that decided to speak up on this controversy, they did not send their best. Stinky McFart ass, the fattest baby in the room, every member of the Paul household. I wrote down here, the family that seems like they might use the word bloodline one too many times in casual conversation. Piers Morgan, Dilbert, Doug Dimmadome, Tutter Mouse from Bear in the Big Blue House. I was listening to him on a podcast with the Purple Otters, and they were saying all sorts of like awful transphobic shit. Yeah, so the wait's been long enough. Let's hear from these people.
They let a transgender, there's apparently at least two transgender boxers that are fighting in women's boxing. What the fuck?
I don't understand.
You can't understand because you're not retarded.
Look at this. This is a man. This is a man.
That's a dude. And if it is a woman, a very ugly woman.
Khalif slaps Karini in the chest, almost looks like Karini gets groped.
And you've got this disgusting piece of shit that tries to come over and, hey, it's okay. Angela Karini wants nothing to do with this guy.
They have no breasts. They are built like men. They are 5'10".
The far left wants to allow biological males to beat the living crap out of women in boxing.
She got hit so hard she didn't know what the hell hit her. It's a person that transitioned. He was a good male boxer.
Congratulations to the male. Bravo on slugging that woman in a boxing match. Wow, you really proved how great you are at fighting by punching a woman in the face.
Is it not obvious that these people are just fucked up? They're really fucked up in the head. Like, I feel very fortunate to have not continued going down that path. I do have to cut them some slack because it is difficult to find accurate news when the only way you find your news is by looking at Riley Gaines' Instagram.
They let a transgender, there's apparently at least two transgender boxers. Distinction.
This article says they're not transgender.
What are you talking about?
That's what this says.
They may be intersex. Riley Gaines posted it on her Instagram, failing gender eligibility tests. Okay, that means they're transgender, Jamie.
Getting your trans news from Riley Gaines is a very bad choice. This is like reading the Jerusalem Post to learn about atrocities in Palestine.
iDubbbz acts like the kind of guy who'd bring a laser pointer to a philosophy debate, thinking he's making a point by shining it in everyone's eyes. First, iDubbbz decides to open with a wild comparison. More people are talking about Aainkhif than the Olympic Dutch rapist. Ah, yes. The classic, but what about that other bad thing deflection. Apparently, the logic here is that if a worse controversy exists, everyone should shut up about fairness in sports. Newsflash, public discourse isn't a Highlander battle. There can be more than one pressing issue at a time. This isn't just lazy, it's impressively lazy. According to the Associated Press, the discussions around gender in sports have steadily grown because of advancements in biological testing and increased participation by transgender athletes. They're not erasing other concerns, they're running parallel. Maybe iDubbbz should choose to stick to the topic instead of randomly guilt-tripping the audience with unrelated headlines. Then we hit the parade of playground insults. Stinky McFardash, fattest baby in the room, and because we needed some nostalgia, Doug Dimmadome. Look, comedy is an art form, but this feels less like biting satire and more like a toddler learning how to string together funny-sounding words. iDubbbz seems to think that mocking critics like Piers Morgan and the Paul brothers automatically nullifies their arguments. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. This is a textbook ad hominem where the argument gets left in the dust while he goes straight for the people making it. It's the intellectual equivalent of plugging your ears and yelling, "I can't hear you," even as the other side is speaking through a megaphone. What's interesting is even publications like the New York Times, who isn't really known for being impartial, suggest that engaging with opposing views in good faith is crucial to credible debate. I guess iDubbbz was too busy writing fart jokes to catch that memo. Now, what's truly insidious is how he carefully curates a highlight reel of out-of-context podcast clips of framed critics of Aainkhif as hateful bigots. It's like he handpicked the loudest, most inflammatory soundbites just to prove his point, even if it meant ignoring the rest of the conversation. Sure, someone might have said something crude or mocking, but cherry-picking these extremes and presenting them as the norm? That's less like journalism and more like a reality show producer stirring drama. By doing this, iDubbbz distracts from legitimate concerns like fairness and safety in sports and reduces the entire debate to a cartoonish portrait of prejudice. It's not thought-provoking content. It's a hit piece in clown makeup. And the cherry on the cake are his jabs at Riley Gaines' Instagram as an unreliable news source. This entire segment is built on a foundation of cherry-picked podcast soundbites, personal attacks, and rhetorical strawmen. But somehow, Riley's Instagram is the problem. It's like watching someone serve burnt toast while complaining that your butter isn't artisanal. Reliable analysis requires engaging with primary sources and examining the broader context. Two things iDubbbz seems allergic to. But hey, at least he's consistent in serving half-baked takes with a side of smugness.
Aainkhif and Lin Yuting are not trans, and it's only an allegation that they're intersex. So when I talk about trans people in this video, it's meant to highlight the fact that the same tactics that are being used to dehumanize trans women are being used to dehumanize all women.
They have no breasts. They are built like men. They are 5'10".
If you don't fit into this very small box of what society has deemed a woman to be, you're going to be accused of being a man.
iDubbbz talks like a guy who's taken one too many blows to the head and now thinks every bad idea is a genius counterpunch. Someone needs to tell him that you can't block logic with your face. He starts with the emphatic statement, Aainkhif and Lin Yuting are not trans, and it's only an allegation that they're intersex. Technically true, but this is a rhetorical equivalent of hanging a mission accomplished banner halfway through the fight. Khalif's disqualification from the IBA Women's World Boxing Championships stemmed from a failing of gender eligibility test, which identified the presence of XY chromosomes according to an IBA statement in March 2023. These tests aren't arbitrary or vindictive. They're rooted in policies designed to preserve fairness. Organizations like the IBA and the IOC implement these frameworks because male biological differences, greater muscle mass, denser bones, and enhanced oxygen carrying capacity have measurable impacts on performance. Then iDubbbz rolls out the claim that some tactics used against trans women are being weaponized to dehumanize all women. This is a gross oversimplification at best. To support this point, he zeroes in on the language used by pundits criticizing Aainkhif, comments about her having no breasts or being built like a man. While such remarks are certainly inflammatory, iDubbbz frames them as indicative of a societal obsession with rigid gender expectations. However, this is a classic straw man. The critiques he highlights aren't representative of the broader conversation surrounding fairness in women's sports. No one is disqualifying athletes based on subjective aesthetics or arbitrary standards of femininity. The actual eligibility discussions focus on measurable objective criteria, such as chromosome patterns and testosterone levels, which directly impact athletic performance. According to the British Journal of Sports Medicine, athletes with XY chromosomes retain significant advantages in muscle mass, strength, and endurance even after 2 years years of testosterone suppression. This debate isn't about superficial judgments. It's about competitive integrity. Now, what's particularly galling is how iDubbbz frames these pundit critiques as part of a broader societal descent into dehumanization. He conflates inflammatory rhetoric with systemic oppression, painting a picture of critics as relentless enforcers of rigid gender norms. But this ignores the fact that eligibility policies, such as those implemented by the IOC, are not dictated by punditry or public opinion. They are science-driven frameworks designed to ensure fairness. While there is certainly room to criticize how individuals discuss athletes like Khalif, iDubbbz's framing suggests that all scrutiny stems from malice or bigotry. This oversimplification does a disservice to the nuanced debates surrounding gender eligibility, where many participants, pundits included, raise legitimate concerns about fairness in women's sports. By lumping all criticism together as hateful, iDubbbz deflects from the real issues and retreats into caricature. Additionally, iDubbbz wraps everything up with a heavy dose of victimhood, casting Khalif and Liu Ting as martyrs in a system engineered to oppress them. This framing is complete dodge. Eligibility rules aren't about oppression. They exist to ensure a level playing field. A 2020 study in sports medicine underscores that male biological differences, such as differences in muscle fiber composition, heart size, and VO2 max, persist even after extended hormone therapy. These aren't trivial considerations. They're the very foundation of fairness policies. Furthermore, a 2022 survey by the Female Athlete Advocacy Alliance revealed that over 70% of women in competitive sports express concerns about competing against athletes with male biology. Ignoring these perspectives in favor of emotional grandstanding undermines the legitimate concerns of female athletes and the principles of equity these rules aim to uphold. Next, iDubbbz recounts the fight between Aainkhif and Angela Carini, carefully crafting the segment to portray critics of Khalif as melodramatic and irrational. By cherry-picking the most extreme reactions, he dismisses the broader conversation as overblown nonsense. His focus on hyperbolic sound bites paired with sarcastic commentary reduces the discourse to a caricature, conveniently ignoring the legitimate concerns raised by athletes and pundits about fairness and safety in sports. His retelling leans heavily on ridicule, framing Carini's decision to withdraw as cowardice while completely sidestepping her genuine discomfort. Instead of exploring the complexities of the situation or addressing the policies that disqualified Khalif from the IBA but allowed her Olympic participation, iDubbbz mocks Carini's actions, turning them into a cheap punchline. Now, it goes without saying, this isn't thoughtful analysis. It's a blatant attempt to delegitimize opposition by painting it as inherently absurd. And after doing all that, iDubbbz then discusses the IBA situation.
Despite what Carini said about not wanting to make a political statement, just dropping to her knees and crying was enough to rile up the anti-trans community so that they could use this as another example.
2 transgender women boxers have now been given permission to compete in the Olympics.
At least 2 transgender boxers.
I don't know if y'all have been watching the Olympics, but I called this a while ago. This trans lie, we have to stop. A woman who got her ass kicked by some dude in 46 seconds.
It's unfortunate that Iman and Lin Yuting are specifically being accused of being trans because it automatically plays into the dichotomy that if a trans person was competing, it would be a problem. And that's not necessarily the case. Sports federations all across the world are figuring out what it means to have a trans athlete competing as a man or a woman. Each federation is deciding different things. Now, I bring up these federations because the IBA is the Federation for Boxing. They are specifically the ones who have been working with the International Olympic Committee to put on boxing at the Olympics. Now, ever since, I want to say, the 2016 Olympics, there was some match fixing or accusations of match fixing, and the IOC and IBA have been butting heads. So Iman and Lin Yuting both competed in the IBA tournament in New Delhi in 2023, and they did well, but after the tournament, their sex test results came back. The sex tests for Iman Khalif and Lin Yuting both came back as XY. The argument that I'm making is that in the year of 2023, when these athletes competed and they were, targeted, sex tested, and stripped of their titles, there was no mention of gender eligibility in the handbook. In the letter that Iman receives from the IBA, it cites section 4.2.1 from the technical handbook. That section basically reads like, we reserve the right to make the final decision on a fighter's eligibility. Case closed, basically. And I just think that is so shitty. If you're going to, go through the effort of making a new handbook every year and changing the rules every year, clearly the rules mean something, or they should mean something. Because what's in the handbook for 2024 is basically what they did discreetly discreetly in 2023. And none of the fighters had that information. They didn't know what the gender eligibility requirements were. As far as they knew, it was be a woman. You can at least argue that if you waited for the following year where you established the definitions and the criteria, that information would be publicly available to everyone, including the competitors, and they can make the decision for themselves. Do I want to risk this?
All right, let's start with the most absurd claim iDubbbz makes in the segment, that the IBA didn't define what a woman was until 2024. Really? Flashing the phrase "woman not defined" on the screen as if this invalidates decades of eligibility standards is a level of intellectual dishonesty that's almost impressive. Women's categories in sports have always been based on biological criteria, specifically 2 X chromosomes. This isn't some arcane new rule cooked up last year. It's rooted in basic biology. By ignoring this, iDubbbz sets up a false narrative that the IBA blindsided athletes with arbitrary rules, when in reality they simply formalized existing practices. Now let's get to the heart of the matter: fairness. Sports eligibility rules, like those around XY chromosomes and testosterone levels, aren't arbitrary or discriminatory. They're essential for maintaining a level playing field. Now, I've mentioned male biological advantages numerous times in this video. It doesn't hurt to mention it one more time. Research from Endocrine Reviews in 2020 highlights that male biological advantages like muscle fiber composition, heart size, and VO2 max persist even after years of testosterone suppression. These aren't superficial traits. They're core performance factors that can make or break a competition. The IBA and other federations base their policies on these measurable differences, not on societal perceptions of femininity, despite iDubbbz's attempt to muddy the waters. Then we come to iDubbbz's emotional manipulation. He frames Angela Carini's reaction, dropping to her knees and crying, as if it were a calculated political statement meant to rile up the anti-trans community. This interpretation is as cynical as it is inaccurate. Carini's reaction wasn't a manifesto. It was an emotional response to a deeply personal and professional disappointment. Female athletes in high-stakes competitions face immense scrutiny, particularly when eligibility rules are in question. According to a 2022 study in Sports Psychology Quarterly, emotionally charged reactions in contentious circumstances are not uncommon, and they certainly don't warrant being twisted into fodder for culture wars. But instead of acknowledging Carini's humanity, iDubbbz reduces her to a prop in his narrative. And speaking of narrative, iDubbbz doesn't stop there. He splices in a clip of Piers Morgan stating 2 transgender women boxers have now been given permission to compete in the Olympics, using it as a springboard for mockery. But this tactic is blatantly disingenuous. Morgan's comment, while perhaps hyperbolic, was addressing a legitimate concern about fairness in sports, not some blanket opposition to trans participation. By cherry-picking sound bites, iDubbbz dodges the complexities of the debate and instead paints all criticism as hateful bigotry. Next, he portrays sports federations as chaotic and incompetent, claiming they're figuring out what it means to accommodate trans athletes. While it's true that different federations adopt varying policies, this doesn't mean they're operating in disarray. The IOC, for instance, has revised its guidelines multiple times with a 2021 framework emphasizing fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination as core principles. These updates aren't knee-jerk reactions. They're the result of extensive consultations with scientists, policymakers, and athletes. By ignoring this context, iDubbbz creates a straw man of bureaucratic ineptitude, which conveniently bolsters his dismissive tone. Finally, iDubbbz closes this segment with an emotional appeal, arguing that the IBA's actions were unfair to the athletes because the 2023 handbook didn't explicitly define a woman as having 2 X chromosomes. And as I mentioned earlier, he even writes on the screen, "woman not defined," as if this is some sort of mic drop revelation. Let's be real for a second. Eligibility rules evolved to meet emerging challenges, but the biological standard for women's sports has always been based on chromosomes and testosterone levels. The idea that it's unfair because the IBA formalized their criteria a year later is ridiculous. It's the equivalent of saying a stop sign is invalid because someone paints the word stop on it. The rules existed. They just weren't spelled out in painstaking detail.
A lot of these losers online have been thinking the smoking gun here is these athletes not appealing the decision that the IBA made.
But they had a chance to appeal, but they didn't. That's the bottom line, which means they're male.
Why did they not appeal that unfair ruling?
If you're about to fight in the gold medal round and they tell you you can't because you're not actually a woman and you are one, why the hell would you not appeal? It makes no sense. These two are male.
I hate these people. The Court for Sports Arbitration is the high court for sports. Whatever decision they make is the final decision. To put your gender identity, your whole being, in the hands of a sports court is already a crazy thing to do. They aren't here to determine what is right, what is correct. They're here to determine what's fair, what they think is fair for the sport. They don't care that you've been competing for the past 8 years, the money you've spent, the time you've spent, everything that you've done for the past 8 years is irrelevant to them because they can just look at your chromosomes and be like, you're a fucking man. Who are you appeasing and how are you rewarded at the end of the day for participating in that system?
Here we go again. iDubbbz playing defense for the indefensible. First, he starts by painting the athletes as victims of an uncaring bureaucratic system. According to him, the Court of Arbitration for Sports isn't concerned with what's right or what's correct, but with what's fair. He delivers this as though it's a damning critique, but that's literally the entire purpose of the CAS, to evaluate cases within the framework of sports regulations and ensure equity. If an athlete believes a ruling is unjust, the CAS appeals process exists for that reason. However, neither Khalif nor Lin Yu-ting pursued an appeal. iDubbbz tries to dismiss this by framing the system as oppressive and unworthy of engagement, but this conveniently ignores the importance of the appeal process in addressing grievances. Now let's clarify why the lack of appeal is significant. The CAS has handled numerous high-profile cases where athletes successfully challenged rulings when they had evidence to back their claims. For example, in 2015, South African sprinter Caster Semenya engaged with the system and became a central figure in the conversation about fairness and eligibility. If Khalif and Lin Yu-ting had evidence to counter the findings of their gender eligibility test, the CAS would have been the proper venue to present it. Their choice not to appeal speaks volumes, and pretending this omission is irrelevant is disingenuous. Now let's tackle iDubbbz's critique of the gender eligibility tests themselves. These tests are not arbitrary. As I've mentioned numerous times in this video, XY chromosomes correlate with biological advantages such as increased muscle mass, bone density, and oxygen carrying capacity, advantages that persist even after years of testosterone suppression. These measurable differences form the foundation for eligibility rules in sports. Governing bodies like the IBA and the IOC use criteria not out of malice, but to maintain fairness. Ignoring this data, as iDubbbz does, isn't just intellectually lazy, it's misleading. Now, his framing of the CAS as a cold, heartless institution that disregards athletes' sacrifices is another classic iDubbbz deflection. Yes, the CAS focuses on fairness over individual hardships, and for good reason. Its job is to ensure that the playing field remains the same. What's unfair is forcing women to compete against individuals who retain biological advantages from male puberty. And then there's a classic emotional appeal about the unrewarding nature of the system. Yes, competing under strict rules can be challenging, but what's the alternative? A system without eligibility standards where subjective feelings outweigh measurable data? That's not a competition, it's chaos. Policies evolve precisely to address emerging challenges while safeguarding fairness, as seen with World Athletics' 2020 update to its eligibility rules, which balanced scientific evidence with the principle of inclusion. iDubbbz conveniently ignores these efforts, preferring to frame the entire system as inherently oppressive. Now, perhaps the most absurd part of the segment is how iDubbbz dismisses valid critiques from figures like Piers Morgan and Megyn Kelly by conflating skepticism with hatred. He keeps doing this throughout the entire video. Their questions, why didn't the athletes appeal if they believed they were wronged, are entirely reasonable. Instead of addressing these points, iDubbbz falls back on the tired trope of labeling all criticism as part of a malicious anti-trans agenda. This is a rhetorical trick designed to shut down debate, not engage with it. Finally, let's address his dismissal of chromosome-based rulings as simplistic or unjust. The reality is that biological standards in sports exist because they matter. According to Sports Medicine Journal, sex-based differences in physical performances are clear, significant, and relevant to competitive fairness. These aren't arbitrary distinctions. I don't know how many times I have to keep nailing this in the head. These are all rooted in decades of scientific research, but year after year, it's become increasingly more evident that the left loves to pick and choose when to trust the science.
Piers Morgan says if she's a biological woman, he's a biological aardvark.
Look at this. This is a man. This is a man. We don't care if they look like women. They have to actually be women. Look at this. We know this is a man. Eyes still matter.
So if these are the people you have to prove your womanhood to, Is it really worth it? They clearly have already made up their mind. I don't think it's worth it. No, sorry, you're losers. The opinions of losers are not going to be considered.
iDubbbz's entire video can be summarized by cherry pick, rinse, and repeat. And this time, he's doing it by selecting hyperbolic sound bites from Piers Morgan and Megyn Kelly to frame critics as shallow and biased. Yes, these pundits are known for their dramatic phrasing, but their core point that biological sex matters in competitive sports is supported by science. Instead of engaging with this legitimate concern, iDubbbz dismisses it outright, as if reducing the conversation to name-calling invalidates the underlying science. What he's doing isn't critique, it's rhetorical dodgeball. What iDubbbz fails to grasp is that dismissing critics without addressing their arguments doesn't make him look clever. It makes him look defensive. This isn't about proving womanhood to Morgan or Kelly. It's about ensuring a level playing field for female athletes, many of whom have raised legitimate concerns. But instead of engaging with these complexities, iDubbbz opts for playground insults, offering zero substance while pretending to hold the moral high ground. If anyone's argument looks like it's not worth considering, it's his.
One of the first stories I read is a story of Eva Kabowa. Now, Eva Kabowa is a Polish track and field athlete. I think she's still alive today. But back in the 60s, when she was competing at the Olympics, she had to take a sex chromatin test. And that basically is a cheek swab, and she failed the test. Upon failing the sex test, she was stripped of all of her titles, essentially erased from the record books, and her results were publicized to the world. What's fascinating about Eva's story is after being banned from competing in women's sports, a year later, she gave birth to a son. Now, you might think that this gives her a lot of credit in the womanhood department. But if you listen to someone like Riley Gaines,
if you have a Y chromosome, you are a male.
Based on their definition of what a man is.
Because they tested XY positive, they're male.
A man got pregnant. What kind of excuse and cope would these people come up with?
If the DNA test comes back and says, sorry, you're a bloke, you can't compete anymore.
Okay, now we're in the 80s. We have Maria Jose Martinez Pateno. In 1985, she had forgotten her certificate of femaleness, so she needed to take another sex test. Unfortunately, she had failed this test. The Olympics sort of learned their lesson with Eva. They basically said, like, to all the athletes who failed the sex test, they said, fake an injury so you aren't humiliated. 2 months after she was advised to fake an injury, she got a letter that classified her as a 46XY male. But because Maria is different, she's built different, she has AIS, and that stands for androgen insensitivity syndrome. So any benefit that she would have gotten from testosterone would have been negated completely. She got dumped by her boyfriend. She was super worried that she had the same condition that had killed her brother years before. Through trying to pursue the idea of fairness, they have been so unfair to these women throughout time, and they haven't prevented any men from competing in sports. And it's not as if that would be the worst thing that happened. Like, if you're forcing a surgery on one of your athletes for them to be able to compete, that basically is like, we're the baddies. We're the ones doing the bad things.
iDubbbz leans heavily on historical injustices, such as the treatment of Eva Kabowa and Maria Jose Martinez Pateno, to imply that modern sports policies are just as cruel and arbitrary. This is a blatant misrepresentation. While there's no denying the unfair treatment athletes endured in the past, these cases have shaped contemporary policies. Today's frameworks, though imperfect, are informed by decades of scientific advancements and ethical debates. For example, the IOC and other sports federations have evolved their guidelines to reflect the complexities of sex and gender. By ignoring this progress, iDubbbz conveniently suggests that we've learned nothing and are simply repeating the mistakes of the past, which isn't true. Then there's his false equivalence between intersex and transgender issues. Highlighting Patino's condition, AIS, iDubbbz glosses over the critical distinction between intersex traits and the advantages retained by transgender women who have undergone male puberty. While AIS often neutralizes the effects of testosterone, transgender women typically experience the full benefits of male development. Conflating these groups ignores the significant physiological differences and reduces a nuanced discussion to a simplistic all depressed athletes are the same narrative. Another glaring omission in iDubbbz's argument is the experiences of female athletes. While he focuses exclusively on the perceived harm to intersex and transgender athletes, he sidesteps the legitimate concerns of women who fear for their safety and fairness in sports. A 2021 survey conducted by World Athletics found that 67% of female athletes expressed discomfort or fear at the idea of competing against individuals with male biology, particularly in contact sports like rugby and combat sports. Now, in another 2020 study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, over 94% of surveyed female athletes reported feeling that individuals with male biology, even after hormone suppression, maintained significant advantages in strength, speed, and endurance. Similarly, a 2022 report by World Athletics found that 71% of women in competitive sports felt that competing against athletes with male biology undermined the integrity of female categories, with many citing frustrations about the lack of a level playing field. These sentiments reflect widespread apprehension about fairness, especially in sports where small margins in performance can mean the difference between victory and loss. Ignoring these perspectives diminishes the very voices that eligibility policies are designed to protect. iDubbbz also misrepresents the biological advantage argument. He cherry-picks stories like Patino's to suggest that all gender eligibility controversies are baseless. But this ignores the scientific consensus on the physiological differences between male and female athletes. Biological males have inherent advantages in speed, strength, and endurance, advantages that no amount of training can overcome for biological women. It's why no biological woman in history has ever been able to compete at the highest levels of sports like the 100-meter sprint, heavyweight boxing, or powerlifting. These aren't aesthetic concerns or rooted in societal expectations. They're measurable, objective realities. Ignoring them undermines the fundamental reasons sex-segregated sports exist in the first place. And let's not forget his criticism of sports federations, which he paints as chaotic and incompetent. iDubbbz claims that these organizations are figuring it out as they go, implying that policies are random and unfair. This couldn't be further from the truth. Federations like the IOC have spent years grappling with these issues, consulting athletes, medical experts, and legal professionals to balance fairness and inclusion. The IOC's 2021 framework explicitly acknowledges the need for sports-specific policies based on evolving science. By portraying these efforts as haphazard, iDubbbz ignores the painstaking work that goes into developing these guidelines and erodes trust in the institutions that regulate international competition. Further, iDubbbz's conclusion that eligibility rules are inherently unjust because they require invasive testing is a red herring. Without clear regulations, sports would devolve into chaos with no way to ensure a level playing field. It's worth noting that these policies are not unique to women's sports. Male athletes also face testing for performance-enhancing drugs and other violations to maintain fairness. Rules aren't designed to single out individuals, but to protect the integrity of competition as a whole. A lack of regulation would create even more ambiguity, undermining fairness for everyone involved.
One of the arguments that I've seen floating around is, why should we accommodate such a low percentage of the population?
I very much think this person is a rarity, but I don't think you make exceptions for one rarity and put other XX women's health and safety at jeopardy.
We're not talking about one rarity when we talk about intersex people. We're talking about a portion of the population. These aren't people who are eventually going to go away. They're going to keep competing in sports, and they're going to keep showing up to the Olympics.
If you're dealing to being intersex, we're talking about 0.1% of the population. Okay, it's a very, very small portion of the population.
Otherwise known as 0.1%. It's not an accurate number. The number is actually 0.018%, but I'm here to challenge what you might think is a tiny portion of the population. Because people with the name Caitlyn actually make up 0.00136%. There are 13 times more people who are intersex than people named Caitlyn in the US.
0.000 point whatever of the population.
0.001% of people have Swyer syndrome, which means you have XY chromosomes, but you have all the normal female reproductive organs. Now let's compare that to 0.000124% of people named Megan with a Y. I could now kind of understand why Megan with a Y is pissed. Is because she wanted to be Megan with an X. Megxin.
0.01% and 2% of the entire global population.
People with androgen insensitivity syndrome make up 0.0035% of the population. To compare that to people named peers, that would be 0.00007%. So you are 500 times more likely to be born with androgen insensitivity syndrome than to be named peers. The reason I'm bringing up these percentages is because I think a lot of us have the tendency to downplay and dehumanize people when we think that they're essentially an insignificant portion of the population. They feel insignificant because you don't know anyone who's intersex. I mean, you've heard these people. They're saying XX chromosome woman, XY man. And then you show them one of these intersex people and their brain fucking explodes. They're like, what the hell? I guess it's like a physical, like a biologically trans person. They can't compute.
The whole thing is confusing to me. It's not trans. It's not the transgender athlete declaring themselves female. This is at birth, I guess.
It's not a choice. It's, I guess, you're born this way.
Mutation in the genes, whatever.
Well, now that I can't say that it's a mental illness, I don't know what to do. This is like analog trans. This is acoustic trans?
iDubbbz challenges the idea of accommodating a low percentage of the population by playing a numbers game with intersex statistics. Sure, it's true that intersex people exist and they're not going anywhere, but pointing out that there are more intersex individuals than people named Caitlyn or Piers is a rhetorical gimmick, not an actual argument. Comparing unique medical conditions to the frequency of a name is irrelevant when discussing policies that affect competitive fairness in sports. The stakes here aren't about how rare a group is, but about how biological differences manifest in competitive advantages. A 2020 review in sports medicine underscores that even individuals with conditions like androgen insensitivity syndrome, AIS, can retain male pattern physical advantages, such as increased muscle mass and bone density, which directly impact athletic performance. These are measurable, objective realities, not theoretical musings about someone's rarity. Next, iDubbbz conflates rarity with dehumanization, accusing critics of downplaying intersex individuals' existence as a way to dismiss them. This is an emotional appeal that sidesteps the actual argument. No one is denying that intersex people exist or deserve respect as human beings. The debate is about eligibility criteria in competitive sports, where physical traits, not identity or rarity, determine fairness. If 0.018% of the population retains physical advantages that compromise the integrity of female categories, that's a significant issue for the 50% of the population competing in those categories. Ignoring this doesn't make it go away. It just silences the valid concerns of female athletes. Then there's iDubbbz's attempt to mock critics by claiming their brains explode when confronted with the complexity of intersex conditions. But here's the thing, acknowledging the complexities of intersex biology doesn't negate the need for fair competition. Sports federations, including the International Olympic Committee, have developed policies to address these nuances. For instance, the IOC's framework allows for sport-specific policies because the impact of biological advantages varies across disciplines. Dismissing these efforts as a refusal to compute is a lazy oversimplification of the highly technical issue. Finally, iDubbbz wraps it all up with a snide joke about acoustic trans and analog trans, aiming for humor but landing squarely in condescension. The real conversation isn't about slapping labels onto intersex people. It's about reconciling respect for their humanity with the necessity of maintaining fairness in sports. That's the nuance iDubbbz completely sidesteps, opting instead to mock critics as bigots instead of understanding biology.
Boxing is inherently a dangerous sport. You're punching another person in the face and they're punching you. So the boxers are well aware of how unsafe it is. The doctors, the refs, the coaches, the judges, everyone fucking knows that it is just an unsafe sport in general. What they don't need is random commentators online saying how unsafe it is to have someone like Aainkhif competing.
Men competing with women and destroying women's sports. What's it gonna take? It might take somebody dying.
She had never been punched like this before. Someone's gonna die.
This is about preventing a man from beating a woman to death.
Radical trans activists and those who support them are not going to be happy until a woman is dead. A woman is going to have to die for people to see reason and logic here.
I don't think that would stop it.
These people are talking a lot about death. I don't think any of them got the memo. There's a lot of deaths in boxing. I think they're being very dramatic because they see an opportunity to push their agenda and they're like, sweet, I've been complaining about men and women's sports.
Someone with a penis coming at you in the locker room. How about my daughter not going into a locker room and seeing a man's penis? He's showing off a penis in a locker room with his penis out.
Now's the example where I could say, okay, like, it's violent and it could lead to death. Maybe people will listen to me now. If you sign up for boxing, compete in boxing, you're consensually agreeing to beat the shit out of another person as they attempt to do it to you. So the fear that these people are trying to propagate on the general public is not a new fear. But guess what? All of those female boxers at the Olympics, they've been doing it for years. Angela Carini, just like every other female fighter, consented to fighting her opponent.
iDubbbz's argument boils down to boxing is dangerous. So why are people complaining about it being dangerous? This is a straw man. No one is arguing that boxing is inherently risky. The concern lies in whether the risks are distributed equitably. Female athletes consent to competing against opponents within their category, meaning competitors who share similar biological traits and physical capacities. When someone with male biological advantages steps into the ring, that balance is thrown out the window. So no, this isn't just about punching each other in the face. It's about ensuring the punches come from someone on a relatively even playing field. Then there's his attempt to trivialize critics as overly dramatic doomsayers talking about death. Sure, hyperbolic language like a woman is going to have to die doesn't help the debate, but that doesn't mean the concerns about safety are invalid. A 2022 study in sports medicine and health science highlights the increased risk of injury in contact sports when opponents are mismatched in physical attributes. Combat sports by nature amplify these risks. If there's even a chance that biological differences could lead to even more severe injuries, or yes, fatalities, it's irresponsible to dismiss those concerns as hysteria. And let's talk about consent. Yes, Angela Carini consented to fight Aainkhif under the assumption that both athletes met the same eligibility criteria set forth by governing bodies. That's a far cry from agreeing to fight someone whose biological traits may grant them an outsized advantage. This isn't just a legalistic quibble, it's a matter of ethical fairness. Athletes train for years under the expectation of competing within well-defined boundaries. When those boundaries are breached, consent becomes a murky concept at best. Finally, iDubbbz's pivot to Megyn Kelly's comments about locker rooms is a blatant distraction. This isn't a debate about locker room etiquette. It's about competitive integrity and safety in a sport where physical dominance directly correlates with success. And most importantly, injury potential. By conflating these two issues, iDubbbz muddies the water to avoid addressing the core concerns about fairness and safety in women's boxing.
Shame on the IOC for not protecting the safety of women's sports.
Right. Other women at an unfair advantage, but unsafe advantage.
It is up for a society to prevent the abuse of women, but we don't do that anymore.
Women getting injured in sport, women getting beaten in the boxing ring is not uniquely dangerous. A lot of these people just don't like it. It is like very obvious in the way that they talk that they feel personally uncomfortable with it.
Women shouldn't box. It's wrong. I can't watch it.
To watch a woman get punched in the face is almost unbearable.
To see a woman violently punched in the head by a man, I cannot understate how despicable that is.
And that tells you all you need to know, because they don't see men and women as equal. That's just a fact. And that's fine, that is like their ideology, but they can't insert their opinion about women's boxing, because if it was up to them, women wouldn't be boxing, period.
Actually, some things are better left to the fellas, like catching blows to the head, and some things are better left to the women, like giving birth, for instance.
Megyn Kelly wants us to use our eyes.
Eyes still matter.
For everything except her ability to box. Okay, so what the hell? So you want me to just very blatantly discriminate against someone and then close my eyes for the boxing? Because Iman's got fights. She's got 9 losses and only 7 knockouts. You look at Gervonta Davis's fight record and you're like, oh shit, what a knockout rate. I don't think I want an average professional boxer to go in the ring with this guy. You can make that argument, but no one's making the argument for him because they're like, they're all grown men. They could choose for themselves what they want to do with their lives. But when it comes to the grown women, they're like, nah, it's about time us men step in because this is now a men's issue.
iDubbbz dismisses concerns about women's safety in boxing by stating that women getting injured in sports is not uniquely dangerous. This was a blatant oversimplification. Of course, all combat sports carry inherent risks, but the debate isn't about eliminating risk altogether. It's about mitigating unnecessary risks that arise when biological advantages are ignored. According to a 2020 study in sports medicine, male athletes generally exhibit 30 to 40% greater upper body strength and a higher bone density, which means that even a well-trained woman in the same weight class is at a disadvantage when facing an opponent with male biology. The issue isn't that women's boxing is dangerous. It's that mismatches like this increase the likelihood of severe injury beyond what's already expected in the sport. Then there's a classic misdirection, framing critics as people who just feel personally uncomfortable with women boxing at all. Nice try, but the argument isn't about whether women should be allowed to box. It's about whether they should compete in a category designed specifically to level the playing field, where competitors share similar biological attributes. By conflating these separate issues, iDubbbz skirts the actual concern, the integrity of the competition and the safety of the athletes involved. And his take on critics being motivated by an ideology that doesn't see men and women as equal, another red herring. This isn't about equality in the abstract. It's about recognizing biological differences that matter in the specific context of sports. Equality in opportunity doesn't mean pretending those differences don't exist. It means creating fair and equitable spaces where athletes can compete without undue risk or disadvantage. Ignoring these realities isn't progressive. It's regressive and frankly retarded. The cherry on top is iDubbbz's mockery of Megyn Kelly's point about I still matter, conflating visual cues with scientific criteria. Look, nobody is arguing that appearance should determine eligibility in sports. What matters are measurable biological factors, chromosome patterns, testosterone levels, muscle mass, and bone density, all of which directly influence performance and injury risk. By reducing this to a shallow commentary about discriminating based on looks, iDubbbz sidesteps the science entirely in favor of cheap shots. Finally, his attempt to compare Khalif's record to Gervonta Davis's is not only irrelevant, but also wildly misleading. Yes, professional boxers, male or female, assume risk when they step into the ring, but the structure of boxing ensures they compete within their respective biological categories for a reason. Suggesting that critics of Khalif's inclusion are overreaching men stepping in to regulate women's choices is a straw man. The real issue is the fairness of allowing competitors with male biological advantages into a category specifically designed to ensure parity.
If you guys want to know how to feel about Imam Khalif, look no further than the way these random men reacted as compared to women boxers who actually have fought Imam Khalif.
It was disturbing to watch.
To me, they've got blood on their hands because there was blood coming from a nose and it was a disgrace.
Would you be comfortable fighting against it?
I've already fought against Iman, a hard fighter, and my last fight was against Iman in the Netherlands in the final, so yeah. You just keep punching in the sport of boxing, it doesn't really matter. So yeah.
Logan Paul, WWE superstar, boxer, influencer, he yesterday said, "This is the purest form of evil unfolding before our eyes. A man allowed to beat up a woman on the global stage, crushing her life's dream."
Very happy for Iman, weathered the storm and got what she deserved. This is sickening. This is a travesty. I'm not afraid. We're evenly matched.
Sorry, it's not more dangerous. The fights have concluded, and Iman kicked their asses, but it wasn't more dangerous. Oopsie. It's like your worst nightmare came true. After Logan Paul, Piers Morgan, and J.K. Rowling give their highly educated take on Imam Khalif, they get to go back to what they've been doing. Logan Paul gets to reskin Lunchables and sell them for millions of dollars. Piers Morgan gets to move on to the next news story. J.K. Rowling gets to write her next book about wizards who definitely don't experience gender dysphoria. Oh, by the way, Imam Khalif is suing Elon Musk and J.K. Rowling, which is just fucking awesome.
iDubbbz opens by pitting the opinions of random men like Logan Paul and Piers Morgan against women boxers who have actually fought Imam Khalif, suggesting the latter's perspective is inherently more valid. While it's true that these athletes' first-hand experience provides valuable insights, this doesn't automatically invalidate broader concerns raised by critics. The question isn't about whether individual athletes felt unsafe in the ring, but whether the inclusion of competitors with male biology undermines the principle principles of fairness and equity in women's sports. 3 or 4 anecdotes are not a universal truth, nor do they address the broader systemic implications. Then iDubbbz trots out Logan Paul's dramatic commentary for mockery. Sure, Logan Paul isn't exactly an expert on athletic policy, but dismissing his concerns as highly educated sarcasm is a cop-out. The point Logan Paul raises, that Khalif's participation raises questions about fairness, is echoed by many athletes and experts who dedicated their lives to sports. Ignoring the measurable factors that we've looked throughout this video about the biological differences between men and women in favor of quippy dismissal doesn't engage with the core issue. It actually evades it. iDubbbz also takes a victory lap, claiming that the fights have concluded and it wasn't more dangerous, but this completely sidesteps the argument about potential risk and structural inequity. The fact that no catastrophic injury occurred doesn't mean the risk wasn't there or that fairness wasn't compromised. Boxing, by its nature, is dangerous, but sports organizations implement weight classes, safety gear, and eligibility requirements specifically to mitigate those risks and ensure competitive parity. Dismissing legitimate concerns because the worst-case scenario didn't materialize is like saying you don't need a seatbelt because you haven't been in a crash yet. Next, his digression about Elon Musk, J.K. Rowling, and lawsuits feels like little more than an attempt to score cheap rhetorical points. What does suing Elon Musk or Rowling have to do with the central debate about fairness in sports? This is classic deflection, dragging unrelated controversies into the mix to distract from the substantive issues. It's not about whether Khalif is litigious. It's about whether her participation in women's boxing adheres to principles of fairness that sports governing bodies are tasked with upholding. Lastly, iDubbbz leans on ridicule instead of engagement, mocking critics as opportunistic grifters who will simply move on to the next story. But here's the thing. Concerns about fairness and safety in women's sports aren't going anywhere. This isn't a fleeting news cycle story. It's a growing conversation fueled by scientific research, athlete advocacy, and evolving policies. By framing critics as shallow and dismissing their arguments without addressing the underlying evidence, iDubbbz contributes nothing meaningful to the discourse. iDubbbz's approach to this topic is emblematic of a broader trend in online discourse, particularly within leftist ideology, where complex and nuanced issues are flattened into binary narratives of oppression versus bigotry. Instead of engaging with the intricacies of fairness in women's sports, the scientific considerations of biological differences, or the perspectives of female athletes who feel disadvantaged, his content often defaults to mockery, misrepresentation, and emotional appeals. This strategy reflects a wider pattern in which difficult conversations are framed as moral crusades, reducing dissent to caricatured bigotry while ignoring the substantive arguments at hand. By prioritizing ideological conformity over intellectual rigor, creators like iDubbbz contribute to an environment where meaningful debate is stifled and important issues are oversimplified to fit a predetermined narrative. This not only undermines the quality of the discourse, but also alienate those who seek thoughtful, evidence-based discussions on contentious topics. But you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.